Welcome to Sorter TV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We're happy to have Patsy Doerr join us in the studio today. Patsy is head of corporate responsibility and inclusion at Thomson Reuters. She's got over 20 years of experience in talent, learning, and development, and she's here to tell us more about the importance of corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion in organizations. Patsy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about your professional journey and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, well, it's a very sort of interesting circuitous route, if you will. I started off, I was actually a pre-med undergrad. I went to Washington and Lee, which was actually an all-men's college. So I was the second class of women there, which is kind of where this whole focus on women in leadership started to develop. And I came out of college and I thought, I'm not really ready to go to medical school. Frankly, I wasn't mature enough. I have a sister who's a doctor and I wasn't ready to commit to that time period. So I ended up going into sales and business development within investment banking, which was interesting because I had never taken a business course in my life, but somehow I got into the training program at JP Morgan and went through the program and then very quickly discovered this whole area of sales training, learning and development, and talent. And it really worked for me because I've been a speaker since I was 14. I was on the speech team when I was a kid. And it sort of combined the analytical piece with the speaking piece. So I did that, got my master's at night in organizational behavior and talent development, and pursued that for many years in investment banking. So I went to Deutsche Bank in London, and then Credit Suisse in New York, and in Hong Kong eventually. Never took an existing job in my life. So this is where we got to today in just a moment. I only take build-outs. I like to build things from the ground up and get people excited about them. And so when I was at Credit Suisse in Hong Kong now 5 years ago, got recruited by Thomson Reuters, where I am now, as you know, to build out their diversity and inclusion function. So I had never been a chief diversity officer, but that had been part of the talent role, as it always is, kind of a piece of it. And so I thought, wow, new exciting adventure. So I came back to New York, started to build that out globally on behalf of the firm. And then 2.5 years ago, they asked me to take on sustainability and corporate social responsibility as well, and to bring the three areas under one umbrella, knowing full well I had no experience in either of those topics, but I know how to build teams and get people excited about it. And what's happened over the past couple years is that, and we can talk about this as we go along, but these areas are growing so rapidly. And so it's been an interesting process to build out the function and to go out and talk about it and raise awareness of the importance of these topics.
Tell us more about the importance of these topics, specifically, corporate or social responsibility, sustainability, diversity, inclusion. Why are they important in an organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, as we started to talk about earlier, it's absolutely becoming more and more important, all of these topics. And there's a couple reasons why. Number one, employees actually expect it. Right, so when we think about the millennials, for example, and frankly, all levels of employees, or all sort of levels of generations, if you will, people expect that organizations care about diversity and inclusion. They want to be part of a company that actually allows for different perspectives to come to the table, to drive innovation and productivity. And you see that in surveys and conversations and going out and speaking to talent, that it's just become an expectation for the employees. Secondly, if you think about customers or clients, all of our customers and our clients, when they're actually going through an RFP process or even talking to us about developing a relationship, they're asking us questions about diversity. They're asking about sustainability. What are we doing for the environment? Why do we care, right? And they're asking, what are you doing in your communities? You're a global company. If we're going to work with you, do you care about the communities you operate in? And so the customers are critical. And finally, and probably the newest part, is the investor community. So investors are really waking up to this whole concept of social impact investing. And they're making decisions on the companies they put money into based on their focus on these areas. And that's particularly fascinating because you're starting to see the rubber hit the road in terms of the business case is becoming that much clearer, that actually there's a correlation between effective strategies around diversity, sustainability, and CSR and the bottom line.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What is the business case for organizations to have these initiatives in place for themselves?
For sure, absolutely. And I'll speak about them in aggregate, and of course we could always deep dive into each as appropriate. But if we think about all three areas, the business case is clear amongst a number of different variables. I think the first is primarily gets back to the employee. So you see that employee engagement increases when companies focus on these areas. Because what happens is employees come to work feeling comfortable to bring their whole selves to work, whether they're a man, they're a woman, they're black, they're white, they're gay, or otherwise. They come to work feeling valued And so therefore people end up being more engaged, more productive, and therefore the bottom line is impacted, right? So you've got that engagement piece. The other part to the business case is, frankly, there's been a lot of studies done around diversity, for example. If you have X amount of women, and actually it's 2 to 3 on your board, for example, there's a direct correlation to an increase in productivity and stock prices. So that research has been done as well. So people are now saying, wow, we've got to have diversity in our leadership teams because, again, we're driving innovation, we're driving productivity, and if we see that direct correlation to the stock prices, then there you go. There's the business case. And then finally, the other measurement that we use quite a bit gets back to the customer base, as I mentioned earlier, which is customer loyalty increases based on a company's focus on these areas. So there's a number of different metrics in place now that one can talk about very knowledgeably, but also very factually, so it's no longer a soft issue. These become real hard business issues.
So what kind of metrics do you have in place to help sort of measure the successes around some of these programs that you have in place in these different areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for us, it's brilliant. We are a data analytics company, right, an information management firm, as well as a news organization. But we're very focused on metrics and KPIs and being clear on what the impact is of the work that we're doing. So if I look across the spectrum of the 3 areas that I'm responsible for on behalf of the firm, we have different metrics in place. So from a diversity perspective, there's a couple different angles. One is around representation. So we're tracking women entering the organization, advancing in the organization, and attrition as well. Not only women, but we're also tracking race in the US and the UK. And we're also tracking the LGBT community. And so we look at it from a variety of different angles. So again, bringing them in, but also watching for advancement and engagement. So that's one measurement. The other piece is around inclusion. So are we creating the culture that allows these different people, again, as I mentioned earlier, to come into the organization and to be as productive and successful and happy as they can be? And that gets back to engagement scores. So that's an important KPI. On the sustainability front, they're a bit more scientific. So part of it from the internal perspective is our carbon footprint. What is our carbon footprint? How are we tracking it? And how do we reduce that over time? So we're putting in place, as we speak right now, some very specific targets and metrics around how we're going to do that by engaging our employees on the topic. And then externally, our metrics around sustainability are about thought leadership. So we have a site called sustainability.com where we do a whole host of articles, interviews around climate change, around sustainability, really with the aim to engage people and raise awareness of the importance of these topics. And then on the CSR side, which we now call community investment, our KPIs are more around employee volunteer hours. So we have a goal, for example, of 150,000 volunteer hours this year. We're going to definitely meet that goal, if not surpass it, and to really get people engaged that way. So that's one metric. And then we also have metrics around how do we actually engage our senior leaders in these activities? Do we hold them accountable to actually contribute to these areas? And that KPI is measured through our performance management system.
How are you measuring what engagement is in all of these different areas?
There's a number of different ways to answer that. So when I say we, the collective we, the organization is developing the engagement survey, right? There's a couple ways that we cut the data and actually design the data. So we build in questions that are very specific to, for example, do you feel that Thomson Reuters values diversity and inclusion? Do you feel valued as an employee? So some very specific questions. Do you feel that you can take advantage of what's happening in your community while being a responsible citizen at Thomson Reuters? So you build those questions in, but then you also look at the data in aggregate and cut it by population. So we could just look at any of the questions on the engagement survey and say, how are women tracking versus men? Do women feel as engaged as our men do? Do Black people feel as engaged as our white talent? So we look at it in a variety of different ways to really assess how well people are feeling about the company through those types of engagement questions. Mm-hmm. So it's one in the design of the question and two in the cut of the data.
How about things like CSR and community involvement and the environment and sustainability? How do those things actually impact the bottom line?
Yeah, it's also a great question. So on the CSR, or community investment side of things, as we call it, what we see is that when people feel that they can be given the opportunity within the workplace to give time back to their community, causes they may have on their own or causes that we have as an organization support, people again feel more engaged and more valued. So you can kind of link it back to the engagement scores, and then ultimately that links us back to the productivity innovation, and bottom line aspect. And so you're really kind of tracking that whole progress there, but it's really allowing people to utilize their time. So we have programs in place, for example, where every employee has 2 volunteer days a year that they can use. We have programs in place that if you have a passion for a particular cause X, we'll actually match your contributions. And if you spend X number of hours, 20 hours to be exact, giving back to a particular charity, for example, we'll give $1,000 to that charity. So all of these programs are ways to enhance that engagement factor to your question. On the sustainability front, it's a different angle, right? So the business case there and the engagement model is slightly different. Part of the engagement is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, millennials, who now make up 48% of our workforce, are focused on this topic, and they care wholeheartedly about the environment and contribute. They recycle, they do all these things we didn't necessarily grow up doing, right? And so helping people get more engaged in doing that and then seeing what the impact is, the engagement level goes up. And clearly, and this is part of our sustainability strategy for 2017, there is a cost savings associated with sustainable strategies in terms of recycling, utilizing, managing waste, managing energy consumption, things of that nature. At the end of the day, you then get the attention, in our case, our sponsor for sustainability is our CFO. You get his attention because we are saving money for the firm. Takes time, but it does happen.
What was it like, let's say 10, 15 years ago, and what is it like today? What are some of the changes that you're seeing in what organizations are doing, what employees are expecting, and why is it all happening?
Okay, sure. So I'll start with diversity and inclusion because I think that's, of the 3 areas that we're responsible for, that's probably the oldest, if you will, that's been around longer in corporate America, as you know. What I've seen in that space over the past 10 to 15 years, and it probably applies more broadly as well, is that it used to be very sort of policy-driven and a function that was seen as a soft function. This is a generalization, by the way. There are plenty of examples otherwise. But at the end of the day, people would see the diversity and inclusion team as a separate kind of standalone function, looking at policies and procedures to enable diversity to happen. What's happened is that the whole model has switched on its head. So now people are much more focused on inclusion versus diversity. Because what people are realizing, and what companies therefore are realizing, is that you can bring in a whole bunch of diverse people, but if the culture doesn't support it, it's not going to work. And you can have policies and programs and all sorts of things in place, which you have to do. There's no doubt you have to do that, but you also have to build that culture. So it's really about changing the environment and the culture to support that, and that's where you're starting to see the shift. I think the other area that I've seen, even just in the past 3 to 5 years, is that, and I see this personally, anecdotally as well, is that the business case is clear. There is so much research out there. We do research around diversity, Catalyst does research, a whole host of other organizations do this type of research. And so we spend very little time, if in fact none at this point, selling the business case anymore. I see that in my own work as I speak a lot, as I mentioned to you earlier, and no longer are people focusing on that. They're just saying, we get it. We realize this is important. We get the impact on the bottom line. What do we do about it now? So the conversation has evolved. And we're seeing the same thing with sustainability, for example, although at not a slower pace. It's just a little bit behind in the sense it's a newer topic, right? So people are now starting to understand what it means. It's a much more complicated space, frankly. There's a huge environmental, scientific aspect to it that takes a lot of time and energy to really get your head around. But we're starting to see people focus on that more importantly because of the millennials. And what's also happening, I come from finance, right, or from investment banking, there is a whole exercise underway where we're starting to see wealth transfer. So in the next 15 to 20 years, 70% of all assets under management globally, which is about 70 trillion US dollars, will be in the hands of women and millennials. So they'll be managing 70% of the assets. So that means, getting back to impact investing, financial services has to change. Advisors have to understand social issues now in order to appease the needs and interests of that particular population. So that's where you're starting to see it evolve. It's moving from a softer, people-related exercise, although that's very, very important, to more of a business imperative and an expectation.
For so long, investors were interested in the company making a profit, building shareholder value, and now they're also interested in social impacts and what organizations are doing, how are they involving themselves. Yeah. Why do you think this is?
I think it's because the two are merging. That's my view. Because no longer are people issues soft issues. You know, it used to be, you think about talent, you know, coming from a talent background myself and running many learning and development programs over the years, that too in many cases, and particularly in investment banking and some of the more sort of, you know, tangible, sort of hard industries, if you will, that would be seen as a softer exercise. But the reality is, it no longer is, because companies are becoming much more agile, they're becoming much more global, and what's also happening is that you're starting to see that domain expertise in a particular area versus having good leadership and relationship skills is becoming much more important. I'm a perfect example of that. And when they offered me the role to take on sustainability and CSR, it's not because I was an expert in either of those areas. In fact, I knew nothing about them. But what I do have is leadership skills and ability to build things out. So I think you're starting to see that merging and that changing focus. And so what happens then is at the same time, companies are starting to see that if they build out those skills that were once seen as soft skills, and I hate that expression now, by the way, these are professional skills, right? They're now starting to see that having people that have these skills within organizations are going to change the culture. They're going to make people feel more engaged, increase the productivity, innovation, and the bottom line. So they're merging.
What are some of the things that you're doing to help build a culture around supporting some of the initiatives that you have in place?
It's a very complicated process. I mean, there's a multitude of things going on, but when I try to sort of bucket them in a manageable, understandable way, right, there's kind of three areas of focus for us. One is around, when you think about diversity, for example, is bringing in the talent. So creating the story, which is why I'm out there telling the story a lot, as are many of my colleagues, so that people know that we care about this stuff, so you can attract the talent that you want. We're trying to cast the widest net to get the best talent in the door. And that requires a multitude of different exercises, you know, telling the story, as I said, going out to different events and engaging talent from different venues from all over the world and from different skill sets. So it starts with that part of the employee life cycle. Then you put in place the development aspects of it. So the development programs, so sponsorship programs, for example, are really, really important for diverse talent, frankly for all talent. I mean, everybody really should have a sponsor, but we try to put in place those more formal programs to help people get that support that they need. Leadership development programs around some of these core skills I mentioned around relationship and leadership, for example. So you've got the development aspect. Then you've got the attrition and the engagement aspect, and we spoke about that in terms of building that into the survey and making sure that our managers and our leaders understand what engagement means and how to engage their employees accordingly, and then measure that. And then to follow the development and advancement of the talent over time. So it's really that whole employee life cycle from entering the organization through to development, advancement, and attrition. At the same time, we have a lot of different initiatives in place to allow our employees to get actively involved in these spaces, right? So for example, in a lot of organizations, this is critical, to really have what we call business resource groups, or formerly affinity groups. So we have 8 at Thomson Reuters, and what I mean by that is women at Thomson Reuters, our Asian Affinity Network, our LGBT community. So groups of individuals who are coming together to be themselves with their counterparts, to have this affinity, but also to help drive the business. You know, it's not just about affinity and the social aspect, it's also about, you know, how do we find the best talent in these different communities? And people do that through their networks, and they also have the opportunity, therefore, to influence the business as well. So we have a whole infrastructure in place around the business resource groups. We have a whole infrastructure in place around green teams for our sustainability effort. So that's all of the people who say, oh, this really matters to me. I want to help raise awareness. Let's get people excited about sustainability. And similarly, on the community investment side, we then have in place our global volunteer network. So around the globe, a group of individuals who care about volunteering, who are out there talking about the options and getting people to basically do it. So it's multifaceted. And I think if you think about the big picture, there's a couple things that really need to be in place. Number one, you've got to have the support at the top. I wouldn't have taken this job if our CEO and our Chief People Officer were not behind this. So you got to have that top leadership. Number two, you've got to have the clear business case, which, as I mentioned now, is a little bit, becoming obsolete in the sense that people know it, but you got to set that business case up from the beginning so people actually feel accountable for it. And finally, on the accountability topic, you got to hold people accountable for this step. So we've also worked into our performance management system some very specific goals for people around diversity and inclusion, for example, that will actually impact their rating and therefore their compensation in the end.
Would you say that there's a difference between stereotypes and these unconscious biases that you talked about?
Absolutely.
Can you share what the difference is?
Sure, yeah. And actually there's even another nuance to add in there. So the conscious and the unconscious bias, and then the stereotypes, just to make it more complicated, right? But a bias is generally, the definition is a like or dislike based on personal preference and experience. Whereas a stereotype is basically attributing a set of characteristics to a particular group of individuals based on a set of criteria. So it's a different angle. It's nuanced, as you can hear, right? But it's a different angle on a similar concept. Stereotypes are easier to address within the corporate environment because it's more of a discussion and there's no unconscious aspect to it. Whereas with bias, you've got that unconscious aspect to it, which takes a whole other level of understanding and awareness, which requires a lot more work on behalf of the organization.
That must be the most difficult because they're based on personal experiences, right?
That's right.
And that's 50,000 employees that you're dealing with,
Exactly, right? Exactly. And when people aren't even aware of what their own unconscious biases may be, it's even more complicated. So just raising that level of awareness, and this is a diversion but related, but when we have some of these sessions and you have some very senior people in the room and you watch their eyes open when they discover, holy moly, I actually do have this bias. It's really an eye-opening exercise.
Can you talk more specifically around some of the programs you actually have in place for these three areas?
Sure.
So we could start with corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, we have a number of different programs. And again, we're a large organization. We're 50,000 people in 100 countries and 500 cities. So you've got to build scale when you're doing this type of adventure, if you will. And so I tell you that because we have things in place ranging from e-learning, which is accessible over an hour, where individuals can just learn the basic strategy, structure, and opportunities of corporate responsibility, sustainability, and diversity, and really how they can get involved and what it means, all the way through to programs like our leadership program for women, which we're particularly proud of, which is an 18-month leadership development experience for high potential mid to senior level women, which has multiple facets to it. It has the classroom training component to it, it has the sponsorship aspect to it, it has the 360 aspect to it, and also coaching and mentoring throughout, as well as action learning. So that's kind of the longer end of the spectrum, and then you have everything in between. We also do a lot of programming around unconscious bias, which, by the way, as I'm sure you know, is the core to diversity and inclusion. When I say the core, it means the one that we really need to attack in order to have a successful strategy in place. So we do a lot of training around unconscious bias, as well as microaggressions, which are behaviors that happen that are a bit more less clear or obvious, but where people of diverse talent and certain populations are not treated with the same respect as other populations. So that's kind of the spectrum of some of the learning programs that we have in place, but we also have a lot of other programs in place because a big area of focus for us is engaging our clients and our customers on these topics as well. So we host a number of different events where we bring together customers and clients to talk about these issues. How are we going to solve them? We may have a panel, we may have a video, we may have dinners, things of that nature, but we have a strong belief in the power of the collective and not doing this just on our own, but doing it with our partners in other organizations.
All of these programs that you've mentioned, building a culture around diversity, inclusion, CSR, sustainability, are they uniform across the globe, or do you have different initiatives and different programs for different parts of the world?
Okay, great question. So we are a global function, and so the way we designed the function, myself and my team and the firm as a whole, is that we have a global strategy around all three areas. We have one that unifies the three groups, and then we have one per group. And in each case, there's a global strategy that says, these are the primary goals and objectives, these are the KPIs, these are the key programs. However, we know that there are variations in culture, both within how communities operate, also regulatory, government, and otherwise, that we have to be flexible. And when I say we, I mean the collective organization. And so typically in my experience, and I've been in a global role for many, many years here and elsewhere, it's always been about 75%, 25% balance. So 75% globally consistent, 25% variation by region or country. In our model, in order to allow that to happen, we have a governance model in place. And so we have at the global level 2 or 3 task forces that exist. We've got our Women's Advisory Task Force that our CEO sits on. I have the pleasure of sitting on all of the task forces, but he sits on that. Then we have our Corporate Responsibility and Inclusion Task Force. And then we actually, our newest task force is our Black Talent Task Force, because we have a heavy focus on Black talent this year. I tell you that because these groups therefore look across the globe and we say, what makes the most sense for our organization given our global priorities? At the same time though, and we're actually working on this now as we speak to refine it, within each of our primary regions, whether it's Asia, Africa, North America, South America, we have regional corporate responsibility inclusion councils in place. So that's kind of the check on what's going to work in that community, right? So for example, in India, it's a requirement of all companies that operate in India that 2% of their profits now must go to CSR activities. So that's something that we have to work within India. In Singapore, there's not the support for the LGBT community that exists in the US and the UK, for example. So we've got to tread much more lightly there in terms of what our messaging is. So those councils, that governance, and our own understanding and experience of these areas really impacts how we operate on a global scale.
Unconscious biases we carry, microaggressions we all carry. What are some of the things that leaders and organizations are doing to help employees identify what those are and moderate them in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, both are really tricky topics. I mean, unconscious bias by its nature, because it's unconscious, is a difficult one to tackle. I think we all know we have conscious and unconscious biases, but there's some wonderful training out there. Professor Banaji at Harvard has done a ton of work in this space. We've leveraged a lot of her work as well as our own to help leaders go through an experience themselves where they start to see, oh my gosh, through exercise A, B, or C, I really have some biases I wasn't aware of. And so what we're trying to do now is mandate across the organization that everybody goes through unconscious bias in some way, shape, or form. And we do it in a soft mandating way because, again, as I mentioned to you earlier, we don't want to be a policy-driven function, but we want to be a culture-driven function. And so it's a soft mandate now that everybody's expected to go through that. So that training happens. Then what happens, which kind of builds off that model, is that we have training in place for microaggressions as well, particularly right now for our HR community, so they understand how to deal with that when people come forward with complaints, which are not so tangible all the time, right? It's a little harder to kind of put in place, I don't feel respected in my team, and it may not be so easy to describe, so we're trying to help people understand what microaggressions are, and again, these are these non-overt behaviors that make people feel devalued in a particular situation. So that training exists. And then, at the same time, to add to the whole story, getting back to the accountability factor, is that what we're trying to do around the bias piece in particular is to mandate, and here there's a mandatory exercise, a few things. So number one, you must have a diverse slate when you're hiring for a position in our company. And whether that means 1 or 2 levels of diversity, we want to make sure that if you're a middle-aged white man, and I talk very openly, by the way, as you can probably tell, that your slate of candidates for a job does not include 10 middle-aged white men who are all from industry X, right? So we're actually monitoring that now. So diverse slates, and a lot of companies are doing that. And what we also just recently started to monitor, because that's the input, right? That's getting the diverse talent to be on the slate. But now we want to make sure that the diverse talent actually gets hired, but not in an affirmative action type way, because we don't believe in that either. So what we've also done is we're now mandating diverse interview panels so that the people interviewing the candidates also represent diversity and don't necessarily come in with their own unconscious biases to hire people that are just exactly like them. So it's merging those things. So it's the education at one level, and then it's the accountability at the other level.
So you're still hiring the best candidate for the job, but through a more diverse panel of candidates.
Absolutely. And that's a really important tenet for us as an organization and as a function, that our goal is absolutely not to say, you must hire the woman, or you must hire the LGBT candidate, or whatever the aspect of diversity it may be. We just want to get the most diverse minds in the room. And in fact, when we started down this journey and we started to define what diversity meant for us, and I continue to use this expression, it's really about diversity of thought, style, experience, and approach. And I may look exactly the same as somebody sitting next to me, but my experiences and my style may be entirely different. So we also want to make sure that that's factored in. It isn't just about demographics, it's also about style.
Is inclusion the same thing, or does inclusion have a different definition than diversity?
It has a different definition. I've heard some interesting ones used before. It's almost like the diversity is bringing in the people, and inclusion is how you mix them up, right? So it's how do you actually make them work effectively together. So the inclusion piece is really the culture piece. And so when we get back to the KPIs, as you asked me earlier, we think about our strategy as a whole. Some of it's designed to bring in that diversity, and some of it's designed to build out that culture that allows it to happen. So there is a difference. And I find in my experience in this role that it ebbs and flows. Like any other culture change initiative, minimum 3 to 5 years, minimum. But during that process, there's got to be some sort of constant rechecking of where the priority sits. At some point you might say, hey, we're doing really well at attracting women to our organization. Shoot, we're losing a lot of them. Okay, so let's focus more on the inclusion part of it. So it's a constant kind of rebalancing, if you will. One of the things we just developed along those lines, slight diversion, but related, is we developed a diversity and inclusion index that we launched last September. And what we did is we took what we do as an organization, which is data, and we have a database where we track environmental, social, and governance issues on 5,500 companies around the globe. And we narrowed down a set of variables that define an effective, diverse, and inclusive culture. And so based on those variables and an algorithm around that, we've now been able to identify the top companies across the globe, across all these industries. And so we released it in September, and on a quarterly basis, we're going to release it publicly which companies are doing best in this space. And I tell you that because there's a direct correlation through that index to the investor community. Investors are making decisions now. In fact, we've worked with a couple of investors to design it based on how well companies are doing around diversity and inclusion, because they know that by having more diverse leadership at the top, you're going to have a better impact on the bottom line.
What are some of the things that leaders and organizations do to identify whether someone has been discriminated at work?
Every employee in every organization is going to have a time during their career where they're going to feel undervalued or not appreciated. The issue is that discrimination, or is it based on a cultural norm that exists within an organization? And so what's important is that companies do have a place for people to go to talk about these issues and to dig deeper into what the actual concern may be. So in our case, for example, if somebody comes forward and says, look, I've been discriminated against. Now, discrimination is a pretty harsh word, and that's, it's a very strong word, and people take it very seriously. So all of a sudden you've got HR, employee relations, and legal involved to help have that discussion and understand, is it really discrimination, which is a blatant, actual word usage or action that encourages somebody to be excluded from a group, versus, as I mentioned earlier, microaggressions, which are these smaller behaviors that are much harder to nail down and to identify. And that's when it becomes a different discussion.
Can you give us an idea of maybe some of the programs or things that employees or leaders can do to change the way they behave to help kind of promote a better working environment, more diversity, be aware of what these unconscious biases might be so that we can actually address them in the workplace?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think I would look at it in 3 different parts. So I think the first one is for our leaders to understand their own biases and to go through the learning and the programs that we have in place available to them, which sometimes may be in a more formal setting. Sometimes we actually incorporate it into a leadership team meeting, and then they have their own discussion as a group as to what their biases are and how can you actually tackle these issues as a leadership team for a particular department or business unit, if you will. So I think it starts there in terms of that initial awareness. I think the second piece then is raising awareness with middle management and across the organization that biases do exist. And I'm a big believer in just hammering the message over and over again and just having people hear it again and again so they can really intellectualize it, because people don't necessarily think about biases, again, getting back to the unconscious part, but to continue to raise that awareness and to roll the programs out more broadly. And then I think it gets down to accountability. And this is something that we're very much focused on now. So we're 5 years into our diversity journey, 3 years into the broader journey, as I mentioned, around corporate responsibility and sustainability. And what we're finding is that now we've put in place the formal programs. We've put in place the formal policies. We have things within our performance management system, as I mentioned earlier, around slates and interview panels that track all aspects of diversity and sustainability to a certain extent. Where I think we are now, and most organizations are moving to, is more about individual accountability. So how do you have each leader say, I, Patsy Doerr, need to achieve the following 3 KPIs within my team by the end of the year, and I'm going to take personal accountability for this. And it may involve utilizing some of the formal programs, but it may also just involve me or whoever the leader may be actually engaging and rolling up their sleeves on these topics. So that's really where the industry's headed now. So put all those basics in place, get the programs in place, get the awareness, get the buy-in, but then you got to hold the people accountable. And that's really critical to the success of the whole effort.
There are studies out there that show that diversity and inclusion foster innovation, foster creativity within an organization. Yeah. Can you give us some specific examples of how this is the case?
You know, the research does show us that if you do have a more diverse leadership team, but also a more diverse population, that you're going to drive innovation, because it gets back to what we talked about earlier, which is diversity of thought, style, experience, and approach. So you're getting different perspectives around the table, and you're also at that same time kind of attacking the group think model. So you don't have this whole similar group of people sitting around a table where you can't really challenge the norm. You're actually trying to do the opposite. So for example, at Thomson Reuters and in a lot of organizations that we work with, people have a partnership that exists between the innovation function and the diversity function to really make sure that those 2 areas are aligned. So for example, our innovation function, which is primarily around technology, given the nature of our business, we do a lot of work with that team to come up with projects and initiatives to be supported by our CEO through something called our Catalyst Fund, our innovation fund, basically, to come up with new ideas that will drive the business forward. And so we're starting to see, with the evolution of that program, this much greater correlation between innovation and diversity. There are some statistics out there. If you look at a number of different organizations, there's probably 50 or 60 that have done research on this topic that shows that there is a direct causation, as opposed to just correlation, between diversity and innovation. And you'll see figures along the lines of, if you have a diverse population, about 50% within a leadership team or within a team, that's going to drive a certain amount of innovation. But the numbers around innovation are harder to measure. But if you can work with these sort of basic line numbers around 50% of the leadership team must be diverse, okay, that works. That leads to more innovation, because then, as I said, you're breaking down that group norm, group think concept.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you face in incorporating some of these policies and programs and strategies that you've spoken about?
It's challenging work, although it's getting easier for all the reasons we've discussed around companies kind of waking up to the importance of it from a business perspective. It's challenging work for the following reasons. Number one, it's still not necessarily a profit center, right? You're still a cost center within an organization trying to drive cultural change. And although the world has evolved immensely in the 20-something years I've been working, and you start to see that people care about this culture piece, there's still work to be done. So that's one challenge. I don't feel it personally within Thomson Reuters, but I know my counterparts at other organizations do feel that. So that's number one. Number two, sustaining the effort. People can talk a lot about the importance of diversity or sustainability or CSR, but these, as we mentioned, are long journeys. You can't just do this for a year or 2 and expect some massive change in an organization, or frankly, any change in an organization, particularly one of a large size like ours, or large corporations around the globe. So you've got to have a sustained, continuous effort and focus on this. Third piece is you got to get the buy-in of middle management. And that's often where myself and our counterparts, other organizations, have the challenge. So when we think about middle management at Thomson Reuters, for example, we're talking about 20,000 people. That's a lot of people, right? So you may have the support of the CEO and the executive committee, which is about 14, 15 people, but if that message doesn't get down to the middle management, it's never going to get down to the baseline employee. So that's a big challenge for us, and it remains one. And it's one that we continue to work at, and I see all of my counterparts doing the same thing. But when you're dealing with scale of that size, you really have to just continue to communicate, and then hold people accountable. Finally, I'd say the other challenge is that, people have only so much bandwidth, or mindwidth is probably a better word. And so the issue is, how do you make these programs, these policies, this cultural change, part of how you operate as an organization, as opposed to a separate initiative. That's when people get scared and then they won't do it because we all have too much to do, right? So, oh, I've got to do my diversity stuff now. So our effort, and as I've seen success at other organizations, is very much about make sure that diversity, sustainability, CSR, that it's woven into the fabric of how we operate as an organization. And I'll give you a specific example. So rather than having a separate talent review for diverse candidates, what we do is we have our regular talent reviews that are held every quarter and work into that existing process, that existing discussion, a focus on diverse candidates. So it becomes part of the drinking water. And I think that makes for it's a challenge, but if you do it right, it becomes an opportunity.
How much progress do you think organizations have made in this area so far? And how much more do you feel needs to be done?
Great question. Hot on the top of my mind these days. I think companies have made a lot of progress, ourselves included. I feel really good about many of the stats that have come out. We feel really good, I should say, in terms of women's advancement in particular, and certainly engagement around the culture. And I think a lot of companies are finding that's happening, particularly in the US and the UK, where there aren't really regulations in place yet. Other parts of the world, there are requirements for certain numbers of women, right, for example, in positions, particularly in the Nordic countries. And so it's a little bit harder when you don't have those regulations, not that I'm advocating for them. But we are seeing great progress because of all the things that we've talked about in terms of companies seeing the business value and the impact. And so people are making progress, but there's a ton of work to be done. Still on the diversity front. I mean, there's some stats out there which I hate to even quote because I'm an optimist, but if we stay at the pace that we're at now, when I say we, I mean all organizations around the globe, we're not going to advance the needle, particularly on women, in the next 50 to 100 years. So we really have to accelerate these initiatives, and I think companies are starting to see that for sure. And that also applies to the sustainability issues. So the reality is that sustainability is a fairly new topic for many, many companies to even focus on, as we talked about. And so that piece, there's a lot more work primarily, in my view, to be done around just understanding of what it means and why we should even care. But there's plenty more work to be done. We're not even close to finish with this journey.
So we want to get some of your thoughts on women in leadership positions and organizations.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on what the biggest institutional obstacles are to women in the workplace today?
Okay, note these are generalizations, but they're truths. Okay, so it doesn't mean that every woman falls into this category. First of all, there's a view, and there used to be a big view, to fix the women and not necessarily the environment. So I'm a big believer, and this gets back to the diversity and inclusion mix. You've got to do both. So you've got to understand what the cultural issues are and address them, and you've got to understand what the issues are with women in this case and address them. So in my experience, and I've seen it firsthand, and according to the research, there's a few things that women are traditionally not as good as men at. Number one is networking. Women don't network as well as men. They don't network with a purpose. You know, we're very good at building social relationships and building relationships, but not necessarily to a particular goal within the business community. So I always tell women who are kind of coming up the ranks, and I continue to tell myself this too, an hour spent networking is worth, 11 hours behind your computer. I mean, it's such a better investment of your time, and don't overdo it. Go and meet 2 or 3 people, that's it. And focus on those 2 or 3 people for a specific reason. So I think networking is important. Women are not necessarily the best negotiators because we tend to be, and again, generalization, not everybody falls in this category, but we tend to be trying to make everybody happy and not be as focused on kind of the end goal and the win-win scenario. So that's a skill we really have to build out in our women. The other thing that I always find fascinating is the research around the risk orientation of men versus women. So here's an example to illustrate that point. So when women look at a job description, they will only apply for the job if they fit 90 to 95% of the criteria on that JD. When a man looks at a job description, he will apply no problem if he fits 50 to 60% of the criteria on that JD. So when you just start there and you think about that, right? That is just the beginning of the process when you're trying to get the talent in. And that risk orientation remains as women move up the ladder. I think we generally, as a rule, have this view that our risk orientation is less. We're not willing to take the same risks as men on average. So those are some of the skills we need to address in the women. But again, to my earlier point, you have to address the culture as well, so that the men, and oftentimes men are still in the leadership positions on average, they need to understand and appreciate what those differences are. And to create a culture where people don't have to behave a certain way to be successful. That culture allows different styles to be successful. I just had a conversation yesterday, actually. There's some women in our organization who have a certain more masculine style, and there are some women in our organization who have a certain more feminine style. My view is you don't have to be like either of those people. Be yourself. Be aware of these issues, these norms, these concerns, but we want to build a culture where you can truly be yourself and be successful in that mold.
Have you found that things have progressed?
I think things have changed dramatically, but not fast enough. I think what has changed is that there's more awareness of the issue, there's more interest in the issue, there's more focus on the issue, but what's not happening fast enough is the impact as a result of all of those things. But I think the good news, and I'm an optimist, I mean, I've always believed that it's all going to come together, it's all going to work out, but I also think it's really important, and particularly as we talk about women, and this could apply to a lot of different groups, but to really encourage women to take these risks and to take on challenges and not be afraid to do that, because it can't just happen at the organizational level, it has to happen within the individual as well. So I always tell people, just be aware of that and go for it. That's, it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody's style, but try to push yourself as much as you can, because we have to help each other to move up the ladder that way as well.
Do you think women can have it all? Do you think they can have a great
Yes,
career
I do.
and a family? Yeah.
I do. I have to tell you that I grew up in a family. My mother is, which sounds a little corny and a little cliche, but she passed away 10 years ago, but I have to say she was a pioneer, and she has influenced the path that I've taken. She, in the 50s, moved to New York from Louisville, Kentucky, one of 6, the only one that left there, to be a writer, to never get married or have kids. She met my father, got married. I have 3 siblings, so there's 4 of us, so that model didn't work out. But my point being is that she was a writer and a working mom, and I grew up in a household where we were taught that we can do anything that we want. We should have a job, we can have a family, we should look good, we should feel good, we should exercise. A lot of expectations, but in a good way. And so that's how I grew up, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And I tell my daughter the exact same thing. She's only 11, as we talked about, but I truly believe that you can have it all. And I think it's just a matter of building your system around that. I mean, we're always going to feel guilty as a mother in particular, or whether you're a mother or not. You have other interests that people are exploring, whether it's older parents or whether it's just activities. I mean, I'm a runner. I love to run. I need to work that into my schedule. It's a choice. Everything's a choice. So it's sort of accepting a little bit of guilt, accepting you can't do everything at 100%, but building a system that allows you to have it all. And I get really, you can see I'm passionate about this topic, I do get discouraged when I hear women say that you can't. There's a lot of people out there that have stay-at-home husbands or may have other situations, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But I'd rather have our up-and-coming girls and women hear the message that those things aren't necessary. You can still have it all. It might be a sacrifice at certain points in time, but in the big picture, it's possible.
What were some of the challenges you personally faced while climbing up the corporate ladder?
Yeah, well, I'm still climbing. I'm not done yet. But in terms of climbing up the corporate ladder, I think this self-awareness is really important. I think it's really important to understand what you're good at and what you're not so good at. And that took me a while to truly appreciate. I've finally gotten to a point where I know that I'm horrible at 80,000 things, but I'm good at 3. And I work my way through those 3 things, and that is building teams, getting people excited about it, and going out and talking about it. And that's what I've built my career on. So that was a challenge to really kind of understand and kind of synthesize what those core skills were. And again, they're different from my domain expertise. These are relationship skills. So I think that was always a challenge to understand that. Working in a male-dominated industry for many, many years was definitely a challenge. I mean, I go in with the attitude, I went to an all-men's school, so that kind of helped a lot. Definitely helped me understand gender dynamics. But in a male-dominated environment, it was always more difficult as a woman to kind of break into, and I hate this expression, but it's true, the old boys club. And I guess for me, I was lucky because I wasn't afraid, and I'm an athlete, and I like talking about a lot of things that a lot of women don't necessarily like talking about. People talk about playing golf or whatever. I'm happy to go out and play a game of golf, but you have to sort of those are the challenges. It's kind of breaking into that. I think the other thing is, and I didn't always have one, is to have a sponsor. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier. I think particularly women, but everyone, frankly, really needs a sponsor. And I didn't always have one. Sometimes I was on my own. I have sponsors now, which is great. But that was a challenge. There were, at certain points, I realized, well, wait a minute. You really have to have one or two people, not just mentors. Mentors are great, right? Mentors will give you career advice, objective advice, and all is well worth it. But you really have to have somebody who's advocating for you when you're not in the room. And that's the most critical aspect, I think. And that was a challenge for me for a while to really get my head around that concept. And thankfully, I've learned over the many years that I've been working now how critical that is.
But it's not easy for women to find those sponsors either.
No.
So what advice would you give women who are trying to climb up in finding some of those people who will be their advocates?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I think there's two very specific strategies that I would suggest, and one of them is the networking that I mentioned earlier. Is just be out there all the time and meet as many people as possible, because my experience is whether the person is your peer, your boss, someone or a level above you, whatever it may be, or someone beneath you, you can learn from everybody. And you never know where a conversation is going to lead you to. So I think the networking piece is critical. I think the second piece is to make sure that your work is visible. Find opportunities to tell your story. Find opportunities to make your work visible so that those advocates emerge naturally. I mean, as our company does, I mentioned to you, and a lot of companies do, we have formal sponsorship programs in place. But that's not the solution. Sometimes they don't work out. In fact, in my experience, and here someone who runs sponsorship and mentorship programs, and I believe in them, but the reality is the best relationships are the ones that are built naturally, not necessarily through this formal matching process. And so that's where you have to just sort of get yourself out there and put your work out there and let people see you in action so that they start to trust you. And I also think, and I'll tell you a little personal anecdotal story which had a huge impact on my career. I think it's important to be passing subtle hints always about your goals. Nobody really wants to be around someone who's overly aggressively climbing the ladder, right? You kind of need to manage that whole message, right? I'm very ambitious, there's no doubt about that, everybody knows that, but you don't want to rub it in people's faces either. So I think it's really important, the power of subtle hints. And so here's my quick story. I'll never forget, I was working at Credit Suisse, this was now about 11 years ago, and a Swiss company, and being brutally honest, I worked for a very conservative Swiss man. Lovely man, by the way. Still in touch with him, he's great. But very conservative, and he himself had biases that I was well aware of. And I was having my performance review in August of 2006, and we're going through the performance review. It was a very good review, I felt really good, and all I said at the end was the following. I said, Siggy, please do not rule me out for an international assignment because I have 2 young babies at home. And I'm not making this up. I got a call a week later asking me to take on the role in Hong Kong. And it was a subtle hint, and that was it. So I encourage people to just constantly just throw those hints out there, because you never know what it's going to lead to. It might not be a week later to go internationally, but it could mean that all of a sudden somebody says, you know what, that conversation I had with Patsy, a year ago, she might be the right person for this job today. Right? So that's my advice.
Well, Patsy, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's delightful. I enjoyed talking to you as well. Great questions, and I'm hoping that it's useful to the audience as well.
It will be. I'm sure it will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you next time on Sarder TV.